So welcome everyone to the Ecopsychology Café. Hello, my name is Carol Koziel and I'm the founder of the Canadian Ecopsychology Network, the host of this series. Today, we're going to have a conversation about moving from clinical to community. But before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that I live here in Cape Breton in the traditional territory of the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people under the treaties of peace and friendship. I offer gratitude to the Indigenous peoples who live here now and who have lived here for thousands of years for the legacy of caring for the land, water, fire, and air. I acknowledge the many creatures and living beings whose habitat was here and is here today. I acknowledge the ongoing impacts of colonization and the systemic oppression of the people and the land on which we reside. Today, as we discuss the importance of community, I invite all of us to embrace wider systems of care and concern. And now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Kimberly Sogge is a registered psychologist with over 30 years of experience in mental health and psychology. She is the founder of the Ottawa River Psychology and Ottawa River Integrative Mental Health, Inc., and serves on its clinical council. Thank you, Kim, for taking the time to share your wisdom with us today. Is there anything you'd like to add before we share your screen?
Well, thank you so much for that beautiful acknowledgement of the land, waters, fires, and all creatures and ancestors. Kathy, I would just like to acknowledge that I am coming to this community, and I consider it community wisdom that emerges. I love community, hive mind. So I'm not special or separate from all of you. I'm not an expert in ecopsychology. I'm just a healer and practitioner working with trauma in and out every day. And I live and work on the Algonquin and Anishinaabe lands, who are guardians of the unceded and unsurrendered lands, waters, and territories in which I have the joy to live and work. And I am so grateful to the great Kitchissippi energies, the Ottawa River, which inspires all of my work. And you can see it's in the name of our practice. You know, the ancestors said that places where two rivers come together are places of great wisdom and healing and peace making. And so I feel really genuinely privileged to live at the intersection of what we call the Rideau, Gatineau, and the Kitchissippi or the Ottawa rivers. And I also would like to say I owe a debt of gratitude to the Treaty 6 territories of the Cree, Nakota, and Saulteaux, as well as the Métis. And I offer honor and gratitude to the places of my birth, the watershed of the South Saskatchewan River, and the home of the Buffalo Stonechild, the Mistassini of the Qu'Appelle Valley. So there are many ancestors, many keepers of the lands and waters to whom I owe gratitude. So all of this presentation and also this conversation is offered in this context of connection and gratitude.
Beautiful. Okay, I'm going to remove my spotlight so you have the airwaves are yours.
Okay, and I'm going to try and share screen. Hopefully this works. Yeah. Let me know if you can see that.
Yep, I can see it.
There we go. So when Kathy asked me to speak, I think it kind of came out of some chats that we had on Facebook, just corresponding about how psychology tends to focus on clinical symptoms. And this is just a reflection on my own training, my own experience of the profession. As Kathy said, or Carol, said, like my background is as a registered clinical health psychologist. I trained at Texas A&M University and University of Texas at Austin for an APA accredited residency. I've worked in the field for over 30 years. And like in that work, I've learned so much from the lands and also the people I work with, and maybe also about the ways that my profession or the mental health profession might need to learn and grow with the current context. So that's a little bit of my reflections today. And I'm also interested in hearing what other participants have to say. So this is just the acknowledgement, as I had mentioned earlier. So there's so much out there in the media now about climate anxiety, and I thought climate anxiety would be a good place to start, because to me it's really important, and it is true that I work full-time as a healer and a therapist, a psychologist in private practice. So I see people for psychotherapy coming in with like enormous distress and anxiety about our changing world, people who are considering not having children, who are considering changing their locations, or considering like different identities because of this kind of looming perception of anxiety in the world. And I thought that the recent New York Times article about how climate change is keeping therapists up at night was a really good one, looking at how anxiety about the climate's future is transforming the practice of psychotherapy. And I'm sure there are people here who are members of the Climate Psychology Alliance North America or worldwide, or Extinction Rebellion has a subsection of psychologists, or Climate Aware Therapist Directory. There's a lot of people talking about how we need to practice to meet the needs of those who are showing up in our offices. We also know that the psychological impacts of global climate change, this is one of climate psychology's founding papers by Clayton and Doherty, who talk about climate change, I'm quoting directly from it, has significant negative effects on mental health and well-being. And they describe three possible kinds of impacts: acute trauma of living in climate disaster, the corroding fear of a collapsing future, like the climate anxiety, and the psychosocial decay that could damage the fabric of communities dealing with disruptive changes. So I really appreciate just that someone has been writing about this for so long. Looking, 2011 was when this paper is written. So, 12 years ago, they were probably positing a lot of what we were not yet experiencing, but I think we're really noticing, we're experiencing now, even in the global north. And also, in trying to understand, well, how can we as psychologists or therapists, make a contribution and support human flourishing in the context of a suffering planet? Maybe you all have read, different conceptualizations of the psychological impacts of climate change. So this is one conceptualization that they posit about climate anxiety. It's from the American Psychologist in May-June 2011. And you can see it's a pretty classic kind of structural, I'll call it a case conceptualization of how psychological impacts fit into climate change. You can see climate and weather intersecting as the top variable. And then they contribute to the mediating. So it's a structural equation model diagram, we would call it. The mediators being the changing views of climate change, media, images, perceptions, and then the three different kinds of impacts, and the moderators that could vary the intensity of those impacts, sources of vulnerability, resilience. So these are helpful conceptualizations, but there was always something as a healer that intuitively didn't quite ring true. Concepts are really helpful, but we can also be limited by our concepts. So the way I was trained was to always ask, okay, what is not being paid attention to? What might be left out of this conceptualization? And we're not getting into debates about right or wrong. It's more from the perspective that I was trained in. It's more like, well, what is functional given the current context? I'm a contextual behavioral science. So in that context, also as a registered professional, and seeing all the people coming to my office with symptoms of psychological distress related to climate change, I, of course, was looking at the science. What is the best evidence for how we can intervene as mental health professionals for people who come to us who are suffering because of climate change. And some of you might be familiar with this resource. The researchers at University of Melbourne have a whole research group dedicated to evaluating interventions for understanding and addressing climate change and anxiety. And the good news about that is, well, there's a lot of things that can kind of make a difference on multiple levels, both at individual functioning, but also what I find interesting about their work is they evaluate, well, does this actually change how people kind of behave towards the living world, towards the environment? And yeah, they're good news is there's a lot of things that can maybe not harm. There's not a lot of convincing evidence of what is like conclusively helpful, and there is very little actual what we would call gold standard in psychology research on interventions that can address climate change anxiety. So the field is really developing from the perspective of a clinician scientist anyway. You have to kind of look at, well, what is the best evidence of what we know today, and then extrapolate from that, because clearly this is a whole new and much more complex situation. And it might require a completely different mindset. So I really encourage everyone, if they aren't aware of the University of Melbourne's kind of evaluation of their literature on different climate change interventions, to take a look at their beautiful work. They make it freely available, and it's quite generous. But I also, when I'm looking at the different interventions that are available, using climate anxiety as like a case in point of how can psychologists and mental health professionals respond skillfully and put our knowledge and resources and skills to work for the benefit of all beings. There was something that wasn't quite ringing true for me. And I think it came from in my postdoctoral year. I was working in the office of the dean for the College of Medicine at Texas A&M. So this was years ago, and some of you might remember Hurricane Katrina. So I was in Texas when Hurricane Katrina hit. And I remember standing in the office of the dean, who by the way, was like a wonderful man from Winnipeg, Manitoba, called Walter Dick. So you can kind of guess at his background. So we hit it off right away. And as we were watching the news, realizing, oh, there's all this flooding in Houston. And I turned to Walter and said, there's going to be thousands of people coming to us. They come right up the highway towards Texas A&M. We're working, and I said to Walter, what are we going to do? There's going to be thousands of people coming towards us, and they were talking on the news about all the hospitals who are evacuating and the long-term care homes. And it's really hot in Texas, right? Like people, and this did happen, are going to run out of gas. They're going to be stuck on the highway. There's going to be catastrophes that happen. And he said, you know what? I don't know. I'm going to call my friend, who works at Tulane, and like my friends down in Houston, and like ask them, what can we do? What are they doing? So what they ended up doing is we literally had thousands of people coming, and I remember people sleeping in the big foyer area of the medical school, and we had like second-year medical students with no clinical training taking care of people on oxygen machines, and it was like really a disaster. And the question that we kept asking each other, like, who's in charge here? And the answer is basically nobody except us. When these situations happen, it's not a program that you're delivering, it's humans that are turning to each other. And this is now well documented in the literature, the lingering impact of Hurricane Katrina. This is an article from the Journal of Emergency Management examining the physical health, mental health, and also the racial equity impacts of disaster response. So this like personal experience with Hurricane Katrina is what caused me to reflect on our models as psychologists and also our interventions. And are they adequate to the situations that we are facing right here and now? This is like old news now, Hurricane Katrina, like it's happened many times over, and it factors much greater than what we experienced then. But it is really what prompted my reflection. And I consider it a lesson in climate trauma, that it made me reflect on how our training, our frameworks, and our interventions need some upgrades. So what is the scope of the challenge? And trigger warnings, I should have put that right at the beginning. I don't shy away from like hard facts here. This can be quite distressing to pay attention to. But let's, if you're willing, reflect on what are the effects of climate change on future generations. Let's just look at it. This is just Save the Children data. Extreme temperatures will leave many families living in poverty with less food, less clean water, lower incomes, and worsening health. Children's immune systems are still developing, leaving their growing bodies more sensitive to disease. Extreme events destroy homes, schools, childcare centers, infrastructure critical to well-being. Droughts and floods can destroy crops, cut access to clean water. The UN warns that many families will have to choose between starvation and migration. And this does ring true for me too. I mentioned my ancestors at the beginning of the talk. My ancestors came to Canada, we think largely because of a crash in the cod fishery in Northern Europe. Where they just couldn't sustain themselves, and then were brought to Canada with the Canadian government wanting to displace Indigenous and Métis people in the Western prairies with white European settlers. So they were displaced from their lands and waters. And just knowing from my own family, like that was 100 years. It's really interesting. It was 100 years between my ancestors coming to the first place that they were kind of thrown in Canada, and most of them died. And they never went back until just a few years ago because it was so painful to remember. So knowing from my own lineage how painful that was, this was climate change. It was like mass migration, climate change happening, causing mass displacement. So knowing how privileged we are, but also just the impact that could really be felt of these massive events on human nervous systems and human relationships for 100 years. My parts that know that experience really resonate with this information in a way that is really painful, but also highly motivated that this should not happen this way for any being. A little more about climate change and children. What we do know is that the climate crisis magnifies any pre-existing inequalities, poverty, effects of displacement, and may increase the likelihood of conflict. So just reflecting a bit, if you read the news, and I hope you read the news very carefully and mindfully of its impact on your own nervous system, but reflect on what you're receiving today in terms of news of the world. Does it kind of sound like this is happening now? It's not something that's happening 10 years in the future. It's not something that's just happening over there. Case example is the Canadian wildfires of 2023. Also, just amazing article. If you haven't read it, it's an article in the New York Times. It's like Our Country Exploded, Canada's Year of Fire. It had like the best data that I'd read on the fires out west. And of course, because I have lineage out in Western Canada, I was like feeling the impacts of the fires very tangibly. Just listen to this. This is not happening in some other country. This is happening at home. By the end of September, more than half of the world's countries could fit inside the land burned this year in the Canadian wilderness. Since the 1970s, the average area burned in the country had already doubled. This year, wildfires consumed that average 6 times over. The modern single-year record had been set in 1989, when almost 19 million acres burned across the country. In 2023, the total has passed 45 million. And you might have, I quickly ordered his books, Stephen Pine, the fire historian. He said, I can't think of any analogy for the extent to which modern records were not only broken, but destroyed here. says the fire scientist John Abatzoglu, who in July told the New York Times that the 8.8 million hectares on fire was chart redefining, and then watched it as the burn area doubled from there. The fire historian Stephen Hine calls it mythology becoming ecology, or a slow motion Ragnarok. If you don't know what Ragnarok, that really resonated for me, being in a family lineage from the North. So Ragnarok is when kind of all the gods, all the beings, all the giants are in this kind of massive and kind of self-defeating battle, in a way where the whole world collapses. But the interesting thing is the Ragnarok isn't about the end of the world. It's about the cleansing of the world as it falls apart, and then its reemergence as it's cleansed. So yes, perhaps we're in a slow motion Ragnarok, but I always want to ask the question, well, what is going to reemerge? Can we sow the seeds and nurture the seeds of what is possible, what can reemerge from Ragnarok? And here are some of the seeds. In the same article in the New York Times, the one that's called "It's Like Our Country Exploded," there were so many great stories, and this is what I always look for when I hear disaster stories. One I particularly liked was about a cafe owner in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, who heard all the announcements about evacuations and the call for volunteers to fight fires and to guard the community, and thought, I don't think they've made a plan for feeding all these volunteers. And indeed they hadn't. So she just opened up her cafe, and people just arrived. She said there were, plumbers and accountants and people who know how to cook, but they showed up, and initially they cooked 100 meals. And then the next day it was like 300 meals. And the next day they were serving thousands of meals to all the volunteers. Just people responding to that question, who's in charge here? Realizing, well, no one, there isn't some outside force that's going to come in and organize things for us as we face this trauma. There's just relationships and people. So these are some photos of the actual people in there cooking in the kitchen. There's a great quote from her in the New York Times where she said, I knew we were out of crisis when after 10 days of cooking meals, and I got the kind of food sensitivity list, and there was vegan on it. And she said, I've been fucking cooking for 10 days, and now I discover there's a vegan. So she said, that's when I knew that the crisis was abating. So here's some pictures of the volunteers with the hundreds of meals they made, and also just acknowledging that the firefighters who were there in Yellowknife and in Kelowna were largely volunteers. So thinking about that, 90% of the firefighters, apparently, I hadn't known this, in Canada are volunteers. So these are people who are just willing to show up and do what they see is needed in the moment. And I think this is one of the most inspiring things about that we're discovering, is that community response is one of the most important things in a time of climate crisis. The National Collaborating Center for Environmental Health did a really interesting survey of what are the things that we learned after the floods and fires. And what was so interesting, I thought this was really interesting because it was not psychologists or mental health people writing it, but they were looking at the psychosocial impacts and how to protect people from trauma. And they said really the biggest lessons were that community connections and community networks were what protected people and what helped them recover quickly. So if our connections to each other are what protects us and help us recover quickly from the climate crisis, can we look at, in all of these situations, I just used climate anxiety and reflections on the Canadian fires as cases in point to kind of think through what can we learn about our limitations and what can we learn about what's required in response. what are the common threads across all the crises that we're facing, whether it's fires or droughts or hurricanes or floods? What holds us together in all of these situations? The scientific evidence, as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says, is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss the brief, rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. I think that the commonality, just thinking as a clinician, my training was a problem well-defined is a problem half solved. And I think that we need to revise some of our definitions of what the problem is in climate psychology or psychological impacts of climate change. I'm going to give you the answer of what my system sees when I see what we all have in common. And one of the sayings we say in clinical psychology when we're trying to figure out how to diagnose a problem, maybe you've heard of this, is when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. As in, when you see all these symptoms arising, when you see a certain presentation of a case, think of like, what is the most common factor? Don't think of something wild and special and unusual. And when I see the symptoms that are arising, the suffering that's emerging out of the current climate situation, my system feels parallels to working in trauma. So I worked as a psychologist in a military sexual trauma unit in a Veterans Administration hospital in Texas during the what they called, the American military called the Desert Storm operation. So I worked with a lot of different veterans. This picture on the right is called the Highway of Death in Iraq. Some of you might remember that from the news, you know, and working with people who've lived experiences of just massive, incomprehensible loss, trauma, overwhelm of their normal coping systems. And how do you help people respond after an experience like this? My system, my training feels a lot of resonance between work with survivors of war and combat and people who are facing global climate trauma. So I think that this is what we need to revise in how we think, or at least I'll speak for myself in my training, which I think was very good clinically, but the focus on symptoms in response to climate change is a confusion. It limits our thinking and possibly limits our conceptualization of how we need to respond to global climate trauma. Symptoms in my training do not equal the disease. So I was telling Carol right before we came on that I really appreciate the work of Ziwa Woodbury, and I understand that Ziwa was a guest here. I'd love to hear more from Ziwa and like have more conversation, but I really appreciate Ziwa's conceptualization of climate change, not as climate change. I'll quote from Ziwa here: the disarmingly innocuous term climate change expresses a psychosocial defense mechanism that prompts us to recoil when we consider the implications of climate science. When viewed honestly through the lens of traumatology, this deepening existential crisis presents an entirely new, unprecedented, and higher order category of trauma, climate trauma. And so Ziwa does a beautiful job in this article of expressing how this category of trauma is different because it's ever present, ever growing. If you read the article, you know, My Country Blew Up, the New York Times article on the fires in Canada, this is like the consistent narrative that all the fire chiefs, everyone there reported. You know, they say if it's a once in 100-year fire and it happens every year, is that still a once in 100-year fire? If it's a once in 10-year fire and it happens every week, is it still a once every 10-year fire? If it's a once in 100-year fire and it happens every few days, what is that? You know, so you could hear in their narrative, reconceptualization of like, this is the story that we have. This is like a one-off event or a rare event, no longer works. You know, it's a slow motion Ragnarok. That's what's happening. So we need frames that understand this whole new reality. And I think the climate trauma frame is very helpful here to understand that this is a whole different kind of trauma. So my background is in trauma training. As I said, I worked at a veterans military trauma unit. And let's just play with this. What if the climate crisis is a new category of trauma? My first introduction to trauma interventions was with Judith Herman. I was so lucky. The year this book came out, 1992. I'm revealing my age here, but I was able to sit with her for a day-long training where she was teaching about everything in her book on trauma and recovery. And I think that understanding the climate crisis as trauma, here's what Herman said about trauma, and see if it applies in your mind to the climate crisis. Herman said, trauma is characterized by its ability to overwhelm the ordinary human adaptation to life, as well as the ordinary systems of care that give people a sense of control, connection, and meaning. According to the comprehensive textbook on psychiatry, the common denominator of psychological trauma is the feeling of intense fear, hopelessness, loss of control, and threat of annihilation. Again, just take a moment and pause and breathe. Let our nervous system settle. You know, could it be that the sixth extinction, you know, which might be our lasting legacy as humankind, you know, does it meet these definitions of trauma by one of the world's leading trauma experts? So Woodbury's definition of trauma really shows, I think, how all the layers of trauma as they exist now kind of fit within this larger framework of climate trauma. And the thing about trauma, if those of you who are here are kind of trained in neuroscience of trauma, then you know, I'll just refresh memories, that trauma is registered in the parts of the brain that have no time, right? They're different from other memories, which have contexts around them. So the parts of the brain, the limbic system that has no timestamp on it, when a present moment trigger occurs, it not only can overwhelm the coping systems of the person in the present moment, but it also activates any unprocessed trauma that's already in the nervous system because there's no timestamp on that. You know, an example would be like my veterans in Texas, when they would come home to their kind of little Texas towns. Maybe as a Westerner, I come from a small town in the West. You know, lots of people have deer whistles on their trucks. You know, apparently a deer whistle sounds a lot like an incoming missile. You know, so these veterans would come home to their little villages, and someone would drive by with deer whistles on their trucks, and they would be hitting the ground, not because they consciously wanted to, because their nervous system read it like the same threat. So this is just human. You can't stop it. It's just the way the human nervous system responds to trauma. So reflecting on how might the climate trauma activate, say, epigenetic trauma. You know, it's well documented in the literature now that transgenerational DNA methylation alterations in human offspring can be transmitted. And the picture on the right there, again, a personal example, is like I have family members, my children's father, his parents lived through the Great Starvation in Holland during the Nazi occupation in the 40s, you know. So this is a picture of like basically their cohort of people who starved, you know, in Holland during the Nazi occupation. And it was so interesting that you could see it in them. They were like very well educated, they were safe, they were home in Canada, but they always had issues about like food and resources because it was a trauma experience that was registered in their nervous system, you know, and it would get activated in little ways. Obviously, there was like no real threat of starvation in Canada, but you could see how this trauma was registered in their nervous system and also in their children, my children's father. You could see how that was also registered in relationship to resources and food. So it was very real. I just wanted to give you a real example. So that's epigenetic trauma. There's also personal trauma. I still work a lot with frontline military and police officers. So, you know, the kind of normal human nervous system response to overwhelming situations, well documented in the literature for frontline professionals, but for anyone. And I'm so glad there's more discussion now about personal trauma. It's coming out of the shadows of shame, that people are understanding this is just a normal human nervous system response to overwhelming situations. And then another category of trauma is cultural, which is a shocking collective wounding of the psyche. The memory of these traumas calls into question who we are as a people, and if left unresolved, can result in a dramatic loss of identity and meaning as a society. So examples of this would be war traumas, or even if any of you have friends or family members who are survivors of the Holocaust, you know, or the indigenous people who've survived hundreds of years of genocide and colonial occupation. Just want to name those as shocking collective woundings of the psyche. And in Canada, I think both settler and indigenous people, you know, suffer cultural trauma from these like large waves in history. So let's think of climate trauma maybe as a case, maybe a superordinate category that contains all of these. Let's see if it meets the definition. So there's a member of a collectivity. Well, I would say, just looking at any bit of news, the figure on the left is from the Valdez disaster. It might be a little old for some of you who are younger, but it's very salient memory in my system. The Exxon Valdez disaster in Alaska, and then flooding in India. Yes, members of a collectivity, both human and more than human, are affected, subjected to a horrendous event. You know, with climate trauma, there is no tense. It's not past, it's present. This is just recent images of, if you look at, maybe this wasn't horrendous for the humans, but it certainly was for the more than humans. You could see as the sea surface temperatures shattered records this July 2023. On the right is an image of the masses of gray whales who are washing up in the beaches in California because they were starving to death. You know, subjected to a horrendous event. You know, whole communities of living beings suffering this horrendous event, leaving an indelible mark on group consciousness. These are just images I pulled from the news. Some of you might have been at the climate march in Montreal. You know, so many young people, you know, beautifully standing up and protesting the impacts on their futures. I'm living in downtown Ottawa right now, so some of you might remember the convoy being downtown. Like, definitely, you know, strong emotions, polarization, and then of course the center image from one of the rallies from the polarized political communities down south of the Canadian border. So you can see, just kind of zooming back a bit, the indelible marks on group consciousness, the polarization, the distress. And then marking memories forever and changing their identity in fundamental and irrevocable ways. I chose this image because I was just sitting in the last week with the training with some people who had family members on both sides of the border in Israel and Palestine. And all my system experienced, as far as I can say, it was like resonance with all the mothers on all sides. And also just the ecological devastation that's happening not just there, but around the world when we as humans get caught in our cycles of violence. Whew, so deep breath. Thank you for going with me, you know, on this journey describing the slow motion Ragnarok. But I just want to summarize. So moving from clinical symptoms to community connectedness, we know psychological impacts of climate change are real and pervasive. And not wrongly, but perhaps in a limited way, psychology is focused on treating individual human symptoms related to climate change. I'm saying this with all the love, and as a psychologist, a member of the psychology community, I think our framing of the problems of climate change and consequently our solutions miss the mark. Perhaps, and I think there's a lot more to emerge from the kind of collective wisdom here, and specifically, I think Indigenous wisdom and two-eyed ways of seeing. But I think reframing climate change as climate trauma is one of the ways we can change the frame of the problem, and that might change our response. We do know that climate trauma activates all prior traumas. So any solutions that we offer must address the historical trauma effects of colonization, racism, war, etc. Also, climate trauma does point a way out. The good news is we understand how trauma works in the human nervous system. And if you understand climate crisis as climate trauma, it also explains a lot of why we're so in denial and so frozen and maybe so polarized against each other and so reactive. We can come out of collective dissociation. And I know I see it every day because I work full-time as a therapist. You can come out of dissociation, and there is the possibility, I think, of personal revitalization and healing, but also that's not disconnected from cultural, community, and ecological revitalization and healing. So I have a bunch of ideas, but I also would like to open it up here, as we've kind of named the problem, described how we think we might need to reframe it. The question we're left with is, how do we heal the greatest trauma on the grandest scale? I will say two things, and then I have like a dozen of other ideas, and I know this collective wisdom here will have hundreds more. But how do we heal the greatest trauma on the grandest scale? I will say a couple of things I do know about trauma recovery is, first, we have to don't perpetuate fight, flight, and freeze. So we know that dissociation is the human capacity to mentally escape an insufferable reality, right? So rather than attacking ourselves or other people for being dissociated and tuned out, perhaps we need to treat this as a trauma response and understand, how do we help a trauma survivor come out of dissociation? Do we do it by yelling at them or threatening them? Do we do it by polarizing against each other or blaming them? Or do we do it just by throwing facts at people? Yes, those are all maybe good attempts, but if we frame this as trauma, how do we really respond? One of the clues in Judith Herman's work on trauma and recovery is she says, trauma is redeemed only when it becomes the source of a survivor mission. So it has to be about empowering and focusing on the creation of life. I do know that we should not perceive climate trauma as a problem out there. An example of this is like in what is called the business as usual paradigm and work that reconnects. Climate change is just a technological problem. It's just a matter of the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, right? Technologically. So it just needs a technological solution. So, well-intentioned solutions like Hillary Clinton's suggestion that we go ahead and do more fracking, in order to transition to more sustainable energy sources. What if climate trauma is a trauma to the earth as well as to us? If we're not separate from the earth, what if the earth is our body? Like John Seed, the Australian deep ecologist, says, what if our response to climate trauma isn't so much I'm protecting the rainforest, and becomes I am part of the rainforest, protecting myself. I'm part of that rainforest, recently emerged into thinking. So responding to climate trauma, healing ourselves is not separate from healing the earth, but healing the earth is not separate from healing ourselves. Just going to check the chat here, a check with Carol. Let's see if you would like to comment, or others have any comments or responses based on kind of what we talked about so far.
Should we? Thank you very much, Kim. That was just wonderful, really insightful. Is it okay to end your screen share?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm just going
Or you
to,
might have to do it for me.
okay, done.
There
There
we
you go. And I'm going to remove the spotlight so we can be in group. There we go. Okay, so under in the chat, there was, Michelle asked about the National Association for Collaborative Health. You had mentioned that. Michelle, are you around still? There she is.
Yeah, there was, you were talking about, right around, you were talking about like 90% of the volunteer firefighters are volunteers. And it talked about whatever, it was something about some research about community that talked exactly about what was needed. And I wrote
Yes,
it down as the National Association for Collaborative Health, but I didn't get it. I know I didn't get it right.
let me look it up. Yeah, that was a study I read. It was called the National Collaborating Center for Environmental Health. Centre de collaboration nationale en santé environnementale.
Okay.
Yeah, and these are just gleaning wisdom from communities. That's all. It's not like a massive survey, which I think is like really powerful. You know, that question, who's in charge here? Well, it's the community that's in charge when it comes to these crisis situations. That's what I learned in Hurricane Katrina. And that's, I think, what is evidenced in the descriptions of people's experiences in Yellowknife, in Kelowna, in many other places around the world. There was in one of the New York Times articles, a really kind of beautiful and fiercely compassionate response from, I think it was from some teenagers in Tuvalu, you know, who the reporter asked them to comment on, you know, whether they had climate anxiety, and they said, look, we don't have time for climate anxiety. The crisis is right here. People are drowning. They made a spreadsheet about all their community resources, and their community government ended up turning to them because their spreadsheet was the best one available for finding community resources and connecting people in the crisis. So they said, you know, you North Americans, you can go and do your journaling and talk about your climate anxiety all you want. We're taking care of our community. So it was a really enlightening perspective, you know, from someone who's not in a privileged global north situation. And I think that we need to turn to communities and to each other to learn how to build systems and capacities for response.